Listen to me for a moment, child. I do not have the luxury of wasting words anymore, and neither do you have the luxury of wasting years. That thing you keep running toward, the success, the admiration, the perfect life you imagine is waiting just ahead. It is not going to give you what you believe it will. I know that sounds harsh. I know it sounds like something an old woman says because she has grown tired. But I am not tired of life. I am tired of watching young souls bargain away their days for illusions. My name is Margaret. I am 97 years old, and I have spent more than 7 decades chasing outcomes that never once delivered the peace they promised. 70 years is a long road to walk before you realize you have been walking in circles. So sit with me now, not out of politeness, but out of wisdom, because what took me nearly a lifetime to understand, I can place gently into your hands in the space of a few minutes, if you are willing to truly hear it. We all live inside the same quiet sentence, I will be happy when. I lived there for most of my life. I told myself I would feel whole when I finally became respected in my profession. I told myself I would feel secure when my savings account stopped frightening me. I told myself I would finally relax when the house was paid off, when the children were settled, when the future looked predictable. Every season of my life had a new condition attached to my happiness. And do you know what happened each time I reached one of those milestones? Nothing. Or rather, something much worse than nothing. The horizon moved. I would arrive breathless at the place I had been striving toward, only to discover that fulfillment was not waiting there. Instead, there was another expectation, another standard, another silent demand whispering, just a little more, just one more climb. I mistook exhaustion for dedication. I mistook anxiety for responsibility. I mistook constant striving for meaning. I was not chasing achievement. Not truly. I was chasing the feeling that I mattered. That is the confession it took me most of my life to make even to myself. Beneath every ambition, beneath every late night and every sacrifice, there was a frightened young girl who had decided she would only be worthy of love if she proved her value to the world. And so I performed. I achieved. I endured, but I did not live. By the time I understood the difference, decades had already slipped quietly through my hands like dry sand. So listen carefully now, because the story I am about to tell you is not about regret. It is about awakening, and it begins long before I realized I was asleep. I was not born wise. I was born observant. And sometimes that is far more dangerous. I grew up in a narrow wooden house at the edge of a factory town where the air always smelled faintly of metal and smoke. We were not starving, but we lived close enough to hardship to recognize its footsteps. My mother mended clothes until the fabric itself seemed to sigh from exhaustion. My father carried the quiet dignity of a man who worked harder than anyone noticed. He would return home each evening with his shoulders dusted in gray, his palms cracked and lined like dry earth after a long summer. What marked me most as a child was not our lack of money. It was the way people looked at him. They spoke to him politely, yes, but never with real respect. It was the subtle lowering of their voices, the slight impatience in their gestures, the way he seemed invisible in rooms where others were admired. I remember standing behind him once at a shop counter, small enough that no one paid attention to me, and feeling a strange heat rise inside my chest. I did not yet have words for it. Later I would call it determination. At the time, it felt like a vow forming in silence. I decided very young that I would become someone the world could not overlook. That decision shaped everything that followed. I studied with a hunger that surprised even my teachers. I worked through nights that should have been filled with laughter or rest. When others my age drifted toward friendships and small adventures, I moved like an arrow toward a future I believed would redeem every insecurity I carried. Achievement became my language. Effort became my identity. In my 20s, people began to notice me. That should have been satisfying. Instead, it only sharpened my ambition. Praise felt like proof that I was finally becoming real. I learned to chase it with an almost religious discipline. Promotions came. Responsibilities multiplied. My name appeared on documents, then on office doors, then in conversations where decisions were made. Outwardly, my life looked like a steady ascent. Inside, however, there was always a quiet tremor, a voice that asked, "Is this enough yet?" I did not stop long enough to answer. I married in my early 30s. He was kind, thoughtful, the sort of man who listened with his whole presence. I loved him in the way determined people love, with promises of building a secure future, with plans carefully arranged like furniture in a room. I believed devotion meant providing stability. I believed affection could be scheduled around deadlines. I believed success would eventually give us the freedom to be happy together. So I worked harder. I told myself it was temporary, just a few more years of pushing, just a little more recognition, just one more step upward, and then I would finally relax into the life I was constructing so carefully. But ambition does not understand the word enough. It feeds on progress. It thrives on comparison. Each victory becomes ordinary the moment it is achieved. And so I kept moving, convinced that fulfillment was waiting somewhere slightly beyond my current reach. There were signs, of course. There are always signs. I remember one evening vividly. I had returned home late, the sky already folded into darkness. The house was quiet in a way that felt almost deliberate. I found him sitting at the kitchen table, not angry, not dramatic, simply tired. He asked me a question that at the time felt inconvenient, even unreasonable. "Margaret," he said gently, "when do we get you back?" I laughed. Not cruelly, but dismissively. I told him this was what building a life required. I told him he would understand later. I told him everything I had learned to tell myself. What I did not tell him was that I was afraid. Afraid that if I slowed down, even for a moment, the fragile sense of worth I had constructed would collapse. Years passed in that rhythm. I measured my days in achievements, my nights in unfinished thoughts. I told myself I was being responsible. I told myself I was honoring my family by ensuring our future would be comfortable, admired, secure. Then one morning I woke up in a corner office overlooking a city that glittered like a promise, and felt an emptiness so vast it startled me into stillness. It was not sadness. Sadness has shape. This was more like standing at the peak of a mountain only to discover there was no view. Just another summit rising in the distance, demanding the same exhausting climb. I had become someone the world could not overlook, and I had no idea who I was without the world watching. That realization did not transform me overnight. Insight rarely does. Instead, it lingered like a faint ache in the background of my life. I continued to succeed. I continued to perform. I continued to postpone living until some undefined future moment when everything would finally align. But the cost was accumulating quietly, not in dramatic losses, but in small absences. Missed conversations, half-heard laughter, the gradual erosion of intimacy that happens when your body is present, but your mind is perpetually elsewhere. By my mid-40s, the distance between the life I had built and the life I actually inhabited had grown impossible to ignore. We nearly separated, not because of betrayal or cruelty, but because of something far more common and far more tragic: emotional absence. He told me one night, with tears he did not bother to hide, that he did not need a perfect future. He needed a partner who was truly there in the imperfect present. I wish I could tell you I understood immediately. I did not. Understanding came slowly, like dawn filtering through heavy curtains. I began to notice the way my thoughts were always racing ahead of my actual experience. I began to question the bargain I had made with myself. Sacrifice now, live later. I began to see that later is a horizon that keeps moving until time itself runs out. Still, even then, I did not fully awaken. I adjusted, I compromised. I softened around the edges of my ambition. But deep inside, I was still chasing the same invisible prize. The moment when I would finally feel safe enough, worthy enough, complete enough to rest. It would take another crisis, another season of quiet unraveling, before I discovered the truth I am trying now to give to you without the same years of detour. Because the real turning point in my life did not happen in an office or a bank or a ceremony. It happened in a silence I could no longer escape. And that is where the next part of my story begins. The silence I spoke of did not arrive dramatically. There was no thunder, no sudden collapse of the life I had built. It came in the ordinary way that most profound changes come, quietly, almost politely, as if asking permission to be noticed. I was in my late 50s then, old enough to feel time pressing gently but firmly at my back, young enough to still pretend I could outrun it. My career had reached a point where people introduced me with admiration. My home was orderly, comfortable, evidence of decades of careful planning. From the outside, my life resembled the very picture I had once imagined would guarantee peace. Yet inside, I was restless in a way that success could no longer disguise. One winter morning, I woke before dawn. The house was wrapped in that deep blue stillness that exists only in the hour before the world begins again. I sat at the edge of my bed and realized something that unsettled me more than any failure ever had. I had no idea how to simply exist without pursuing something. Achievement had been my compass for so long that without it, I felt strangely directionless. The thought frightened me. If I was not striving, improving, proving, then who was I? That question followed me like a shadow for months. I began noticing small moments I had previously rushed past. The way sunlight moved slowly across the kitchen floor. The sound of my own breathing when I finally sat still long enough to hear it. The fragile beauty of ordinary conversations that did not lead anywhere productive. These things felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like muscles I had never learned to use. At first, I treated stillness as another task to master. I read books about mindfulness. I scheduled quiet walks as if they were meetings. I approached peace with the same disciplined intensity I had once applied to ambition. And of course, that did not work. You cannot conquer serenity. You can only allow it. The true shift began when my health faltered. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough of a warning to interrupt my illusion of control. A persistent fatigue. A tightening in my chest that appeared during moments of stress. Doctors spoke in cautious tones about balance, about the accumulated cost of decades lived in constant tension. For the first time, I was forced to consider the possibility that life would not wait patiently for me to finish chasing my goals. I remember sitting alone after one appointment, hands folded in my lap like a child awaiting instruction. It occurred to me then, with startling clarity, that I had been living as if my worth depended on perpetual motion, as if slowing down would somehow expose me as insufficient. That afternoon, I did something radical. I went home and did nothing, not for an hour, not as a reward after productivity. I did nothing because I was tired of running from myself. I sat in the quiet and let every uncomfortable thought rise to the surface. Regret, fear, a deep, aching grief for the years I had postponed my own life in the name of preparing for it. There is a particular kind of sorrow that comes when you realize you have been both the architect and the prisoner of your own expectations. I cried in a way I had not allowed myself to cry since childhood, not delicately, not politely. The kind of crying that rearranges something inside you. And when the storm passed, what remained was not despair, but a fragile clarity. I saw then that everything I had pursued, recognition, security, admiration, had been attempts to quiet an inner voice that insisted I was not enough as I was. I had been negotiating with my own existence, offering achievements as proof that I deserved to be here. But existence does not require justification. That realization did not instantly make me peaceful. Awakening is not a single moment of enlightenment. It is a gradual untangling. I still caught myself comparing, striving, reaching for external validation like an old habit I had worn smooth with use. Yet something fundamental had shifted. I could no longer pretend that fulfillment was waiting somewhere outside me. Around this time, I began observing the lives of those around me with a different kind of attention. Some of my peers were still locked in the same restless pursuit that had defined my younger years. They measured their value in possessions, in social standing, in the subtle competition that persists even in old age. One acquaintance, well into her 80s, spent entire afternoons cataloging the ways others seemed more fortunate. Her conversations were inventories of lack. Watching her was like glimpsing a possible future I had narrowly avoided. Others, however, had discovered a gentler rhythm. There was a woman I met during my morning walks, Elena, a retired teacher with arthritic hands and an unremarkable pension. By every conventional standard, she had little to boast about. Yet she moved through the world with a lightness that fascinated me. She greeted strangers as if they were old friends. She spoke of small pleasures, a blooming flower, a well-written paragraph, the taste of warm bread, with genuine delight. One day I asked her, half joking, what her secret was. She smiled in a way that suggested the answer was both simple and profound. "I stopped waiting," she said. "I stopped postponing my permission to be content." Her words echoed inside me long after we parted. I began experimenting with a different way of living, not dramatically, not all at once. I allowed myself to leave work earlier without inventing an excuse. I listened more fully when people spoke, resisting the urge to mentally rehearse my next obligation. I sat beside my husband in the evenings without filling the silence with plans or anxieties. Something unexpected happened. The world did not collapse. My value did not evaporate. Instead, life began to feel richer in ways I had never anticipated. Moments that once seemed insignificant revealed layers of quiet meaning, a shared laugh, the comfort of familiar hands, the simple miracle of waking to another ordinary day. Freedom, I discovered, is not the absence of responsibility. It is the absence of the inner compulsion to prove your right to exist. This understanding deepened as friends and colleagues began facing the undeniable truth of aging. Illness visited some. Loss visited many. In hospital rooms and funeral gatherings, the illusions that had driven us for decades appeared suddenly fragile. Titles could not hold a trembling hand. Savings accounts could not manufacture more time. What mattered in those final chapters was startlingly consistent: presence, connection, a sense of reconciliation with one's own life. I realized then that peace is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It is a practice, a daily decision to release the endless negotiation with circumstances, a willingness to meet each moment without demanding that it be different before you allow yourself to be okay. By the time I reached my 70s, this practice had become a quiet foundation beneath everything else. I still cared about contributing, about learning, about offering what I could to the world. But the frantic edge was gone. I was no longer running toward a finish line that receded with every step. Instead, I had begun, finally, to inhabit the life that had been unfolding around me all along. And yet, even with this awakening, one final lesson remained. a lesson that only the passage of many more years would carve deeply enough into my heart for me to speak of it with certainty. That is where my story now leads you. It is a strange thing to begin living more fully at an age when society quietly expects you to begin withdrawing. Yet that is exactly what happened to me. While others around me spoke more and more about endings, I found myself discovering beginnings hidden inside ordinary hours. I started paying attention to how people my age carried their memories. Some wore them like medals, heavy and shining, proof of battles fought and victories earned. Others carried them like stones in their pockets, weighing down every step. I realized that aging does not automatically grant wisdom. It simply reveals the habits of the heart you have practiced for decades. There was a man in our neighborhood, a retired executive who had once commanded entire floors of employees with a single glance. Even in his 80s, he still introduced himself by his former title, as if the past were a coat he refused to remove. He was polite, articulate, financially secure, and profoundly unhappy. Every conversation drifted toward comparison. Who had achieved more? Whose children were more successful? Whose investments had performed better? His mind remained trapped in a scoreboard that no longer mattered. Watching him unsettled me because I recognized my younger self in his restlessness. I understood how seductive that constant measuring could be. It gives the illusion of purpose. It convinces you that life is a race you can still win if you just push harder. But the finish line, as I had learned, is not real. It is a mirage sustained by fear. Fear of insignificance. Fear of being forgotten. Fear that without external proof, we might discover there was never anything inherently valuable about us at all. The deeper I reflected, the more I saw that most of my life had been governed by that quiet terror. Even my kindness had sometimes been strategic, offered in exchange for approval. Even my generosity had carried an invisible ledger. I had loved, yes, but I had also negotiated. Accepting this was not comfortable. There is a particular humility required to admit that you have spent years misunderstanding your own motives. Yet, with that humility came a surprising tenderness toward myself. I began to see the young woman I once was not as foolish, but as frightened. She had been trying to build safety in the only ways she knew. So I started practicing something I had rarely offered before: compassion directed inward. It sounds simple when spoken aloud. In reality, it is one of the most demanding disciplines a human being can undertake. To sit quietly with your own imperfections, to acknowledge missed chances without constructing elaborate defenses, to forgive yourself for the ways you tried to earn love instead of simply receiving it. This practice softened me. It also sharpened my perception. I noticed that genuine contentment in older people did not correlate neatly with wealth, health, or even family circumstances. I knew widows who radiated warmth and purpose, and millionaires who drifted through their days like ghosts. I knew men burdened by chronic pain who still greeted each sunrise with gratitude, and others in perfect physical condition who could find fault in every blessing. The difference, I realized, lay in whether they had made peace with themselves. Peace is not passive. It is not resignation. It is an active reconciliation with reality, including the reality of your own limitations. It is the quiet confidence that your worth is not up for debate, that you are allowed to occupy your life without continually justifying your presence. Around my 75th year, I began volunteering at a small community center. Nothing glamorous. I organized books, poured tea, listened to stories that wandered and repeated themselves. In those modest rooms, I witnessed more wisdom than I had encountered in many corporate boardrooms. Elderly women who had lost almost everything still found ways to laugh. Men who had once been formidable now admitted their fears with disarming honesty. One afternoon, a frail gentleman took my hand and said something that settled deep into my bones. "Do not wait," he whispered. "Waiting is how we lose our lives." His words echoed truths I had been circling for decades, waiting to feel ready, waiting to feel secure, waiting to feel worthy. We imagine that some future version of ourselves will finally grant permission to relax into being alive. But that permission, I was learning, must be given now, or it may never be given at all. By the time I reached my 90s, the urgency of this understanding had become unmistakable. Friends disappeared more frequently. Conversations turned toward legacy, toward what remains when ambition and achievement have fallen silent. I found myself less interested in how my life would be remembered and more interested in how fully I was inhabiting the days still offered to me. There is a clarity that comes when time is no longer an abstract concept, but a tangible companion walking beside you. You begin to see that fulfillment was never hiding at the end of effort. It was present in every step, waiting patiently for your attention. And yet, even with this clarity, I carried one final realization that would only crystallize in the quiet years approaching a century of living. A realization so simple that it almost feels embarrassing to speak it aloud, and yet so powerful that it has the ability to free a person from decades of unnecessary struggle. That realization is what I will leave you with next. So here we are, you and I, meeting across the distance of generations, you somewhere in the thick of becoming. Me, standing at the far shoreline of almost a century, looking back at the long river I once believed I had to conquer. Let me tell you plainly now, because at 97, there is no reason left to decorate the truth. Most of what you are chasing is not wrong. It is simply misplaced. There is nothing sinful about ambition, nothing shameful about wanting security, recognition, comfort, or even admiration. These are human desires. They rise naturally inside us like tides. The tragedy is not that we want these things. The tragedy is that we believe they will finally complete us. They will not. Completion is not an event waiting in your future. It is a decision waiting in your present. If I could place one lesson directly into your heart, bypassing the years of confusion that shaped mine, it would be this. You do not have to earn the right to feel at peace with yourself. You do not have to negotiate with life in order to be allowed to exist. The sense of enoughness you are trying to purchase with effort has never been for sale. It has always been yours. I spent decades trying to build an identity strong enough to silence my doubts. I believed that if I accumulated enough proof, achievements, possessions, praise, the anxious voice inside me would finally grow quiet. Instead, every new success only raised the standard I felt compelled to meet. Satisfaction remained just out of reach, like a horizon that retreats as you approach it. It took the slow humbling of time to teach me that freedom does not come from finally getting everything right. It comes from no longer needing everything to be right before you allow yourself to breathe. Now, in the small and luminous days that remain to me, I measure my life differently, not by how much I have secured, but by how deeply I am present, not by how many people approve of me, but by how honestly I am able to meet my own reflection. There is a quiet joy in this way of living, a steadiness that does not depend on circumstances behaving themselves. You will still strive, you will still dream, you will still build and lose and build again. That is the rhythm of being human. But do not postpone your permission to be alive until you cross some imaginary finish line. The finish line is a story we tell ourselves to make exhaustion feel meaningful. Your life is not waiting for you somewhere ahead. It is unfolding right now, in this unrepeatable moment. If I sound urgent, it is because I am, not out of fear, but out of love for the time you still possess in abundance. I have buried too many friends who believed they had more years to finally relax into themselves. I have watched too many brilliant souls spend their entire lives rehearsing for a happiness they never allowed themselves to experience. So stop, just for a breath. Feel the simple fact that you are here. You are not a project that must be perfected. You are not a problem that must be solved. You are a living presence, already worthy of the space you occupy. Everything else, the titles, the victories, the carefully arranged plans, can be meaningful additions. But they must never again be mistaken for the source of your value. It took me more than 50 years to understand that. You have heard it in a few minutes. What you do with it now will quietly shape the entire story of your life.